Welcome to another journey through the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we'll step into a world where silence was profound, where music was precious beyond measure, and where the simple act of hearing a melody could transform a soul forever. Imagine settling back into the comfort of your modern world, surrounded by the gentle hum of electricity, the distant murmur of traffic, perhaps the soft glow of streetlights filtering through your windows. These sounds that we barely notice formed no part of medieval existence. Instead, picture a world where silence was the natural state, broken only by the wind through thatch, the lowing of cattle, or the distant toll of church bells marking the hours of prayer. In this quieter world, music held a power we can barely comprehend today. It was rare, precious, and transformative in ways that our sound-saturated age has forgotten. Tonight, we'll explore what it truly meant to hear music for the first time in medieval times. Follow the extraordinary life of history's most powerful medieval woman who claimed her music came from divine visions. Uncover the mystery of a dancing plague that consumed an entire city, and step into the privileged yet precarious world of court musicians who lived between artistry and survival. Let us begin by stepping into your simple medieval cottage as dawn approaches, and discovering what it truly meant to live in a world where music was magic. The first sensation that strikes you about medieval life is the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a modern evening when you've turned off your devices, but a profound, enveloping silence that stretched across entire landscapes. You wake in your one-room cottage, as you have every morning for years, to a world where the absence of sound is the natural state of being. Your cottage, like most peasant dwellings, is a simple affair of wattle and daub, timber and thatch. The walls are thick enough to muffle the worst of winter winds, but thin enough that you hear every sound your neighbors make. And yet, there are so few sounds to hear. No electrical hum, no distant highway traffic, no aircraft overhead. The soundscape of your world consists of wind through grain, the creak of settling timber, the occasional stamp and snort of your neighbor's ox, and the rhythmic sounds of human labor that mark the passing hours. This silence shapes everything about how you perceive the world. Your ears, unassaulted by the constant background noise of modern life, have developed an acute sensitivity that we can hardly imagine. You can distinguish between the footsteps of different neighbors on the packed earth path outside your door. You know by the sound of their breathing whether your family members are truly asleep or merely pretending. The crack of a twig in the forest carries for remarkable distances, and you've learned to read the subtle changes in birdsong that herald shifts in weather or season. In this world of heightened auditory awareness, music is not simply entertainment. It is transformation. Most days pass without any music at all, save for the work songs that help coordinate labor during harvest time. These are simple, repetitive melodies that help synchronize the swing of scythes or the rhythm of threshing. They're functional rather than beautiful, designed to make exhausting work slightly more bearable rather than to inspire or uplift. Perhaps once or twice a year, during the great feast days, a traveling minstrel might arrive at your village. Word spreads quickly through the settlement. There will be music tonight. The entire community gathers in the largest building available, usually the Lord's Hall if he permits it, or sometimes simply in the village square if weather allows. The minstrel carries a simple instrument, perhaps a lute with its warm, plucked tones, or a small harp that catches the firelight as his fingers dance across the strings. But even this preparation cannot ready you for the first time you hear what we would consider real music, the complex, layered harmonies that will later be called polyphony. This moment comes, for most medieval people, when they first enter a cathedral or large church during a major religious celebration. Picture yourself on such a day, perhaps Easter or Christmas, when even the poorest peasants are encouraged to attend the great services. You've walked for hours, possibly days, to reach the cathedral town. Your rough woolen clothes mark you immediately as a person of humble station, and you're directed to the back of the vast stone space, far from the altar where the nobility will stand or kneel on precious carpets. The cathedral itself is overwhelming in ways that go beyond its sheer size. The stone walls rise impossibly high above your head, disappearing into shadows that seem to touch the sky itself. Colored light streams through windows made of jewel-bright glass, creating patterns that shift and dance as clouds pass overhead. The very air feels different here, cooler, more still, charged with a sense of the sacred that makes you instinctively lower your voice to a whisper. But nothing has prepared you for what happens when the service begins and you hear Gregorian chant for the first time. The sound begins as a single voice, clear and pure, rising from somewhere near the altar that you can barely see. The melody is unlike anything you've ever heard. Not the simple, earthbound work songs of the fields, but something that seems to float, to soar, to reach toward heaven itself. The single voice is joined by another, then another, until a choir of trained singers fills the enormous space with sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The effect is overwhelming, almost frightening in its power. The stone walls, which seemed so solid and permanent, now serve as a vast musical instrument, catching each note and sending it back transformed, layered with echoes and harmonics that create sounds no human voice actually sang. Your chest vibrates with the deep bass notes. The high, sweet soprano lines seem to pierce directly into your soul. You feel tears on your cheeks and realize you're crying, though you couldn't say exactly why. This is your first encounter with what scholars will later call the supernatural power of acoustic architecture. The cathedral has been designed not just as a place of worship, but as a musical instrument in itself. Every arch, every column, every calculated dimension serves to shape and enhance the human voice until it becomes something more than human. The monks and clerics who sing these chants have spent years learning not just the melodies, but how to work with the building itself, how to time their breathing to account for the seconds-long echoes, how to blend their voices with the ghostly repetitions that bounce from stone to stone. For you, standing in the back of this vast space, it feels like being present at the moment of creation itself. The music seems to give substance to the colored light, to make visible the presence of the divine that the priests speak of, but that usually remains frustratingly abstract. You understand, in this moment, why the church has poured so much wealth into these buildings, why entire communities have labored for generations to create these acoustic marvels. This music justifies everything. The crushing taxes, the years of backbreaking labor, the submission to authority that defines your daily life. But even as you're swept away by the beauty of what you're hearing, you're also becoming aware of something else. The profound inequality that governs even this most ethereal of experiences. The music you're hearing is not for you. Not really. It's being performed by men who have dedicated their entire lives to its study and practice. Men who can read the mysterious marks on parchment that somehow encode these complex melodies. You cannot read these marks, cannot reproduce these sounds, cannot even begin to understand how such music is created. This musical literacy is as much a mark of social class as the fine clothes worn by the nobles near the altar or the quality of the food served at different tables during feast days. The ability to read musical notation, to understand the complex mathematical relationships that govern harmony and rhythm, to perform with the precision required for polyphonic music. These skills are the exclusive province of the educated elite, primarily clerics and the occasional court musician. Even the instruments capable of producing such complex music are far beyond your reach. A properly constructed organ, with its hundreds of pipes and complex mechanism of bellows and keys, represents wealth beyond imagining. The large harps used by professional musicians cost more than your family earns in several years. Even a well-made lute, with its delicate construction and requirement for constant maintenance and restringing, is a luxury item accessible only to those with significant disposable income. And so you listen, transported but also excluded, uplifted but also reminded of your place in the great hierarchy of medieval society. The music is magnificent, but it is not yours. You may hear it, but you cannot make it. You may be moved by it, but you cannot control it. In this moment of transcendence, you're also experiencing one of the fundamental realities of medieval life. Beauty and wonder exist, but they are distributed according to the rigid social stratification that governs every aspect of existence. As the service continues, you begin to notice other layers of the musical experience. Between the complex choral pieces, there are moments when the entire congregation, including you, is expected to participate in simpler chants. These unison melodies are still more sophisticated than anything you sing in your daily life, but they're designed to be learned by ear and repeated by people who cannot read music. Your voice, rough from years of outdoor labor and unpracticed in anything more complex than work songs, blends with hundreds of others in a different kind of musical experience. This congregational singing gives you a taste of music making from the inside, and it's exhilarating in a different way from listening to the trained choir. When your voice joins with those around you, when you feel the subtle push and pull as the group finds its rhythm together, when a simple melody becomes something larger and more powerful than any individual could create alone. In these moments, you glimpse what music might be like if it weren't divided by the barriers of education and social class. But these moments are brief and carefully controlled. The melodies you're allowed to sing are ancient, prescribed by tradition and religious authority. There is no room for improvisation, no space for personal expression. Even this limited participation in music making is governed by the same hierarchical principles that structure every other aspect of medieval society. You may sing, but only what you're told to sing when you're told to sing it, in the manner decreed by those whose education and position give them the authority to direct such matters. As the long service finally draws to a close and you prepare to make the journey back to your village, your mind buzzes with the music you've heard. You try to recall the melodies, to hold on to the memory of those soaring harmonies, but already the details are beginning to fade. Without musical notation, without the ability to write down or systematically study what you've experienced, you're dependent on memory alone to preserve these sounds. And memory, you're discovering, is frustratingly inadequate for capturing the complexity of what you've heard. This struggle to remember and reproduce music is one of the defining characteristics of medieval musical culture for ordinary people. The vast majority of the population experiences music as a purely ephemeral art form. It exists only in the moment of performance, vanishing as soon as the last note fades. Unlike the wealthy and educated, who can preserve complex compositions in written form, most people must rely on oral tradition to maintain any musical knowledge at all. The work songs that accompany agricultural labor are passed down through generations by constant repetition, slowly evolving as individual singers add their own variations or misremember details from year to year. Dance melodies played at seasonal celebrations exist only as long as someone remembers them well enough to teach them to the next generation. When an elderly villager dies, any songs or tunes they carried in their memory may disappear forever, lost to the community as irretrievably as if they had never existed. This oral tradition creates a musical culture that is both remarkably stable and constantly changing. The basic structures of work songs and dance tunes may remain consistent for centuries, serving the same functional purposes generation after generation. But the details, the specific embellishments, the regional variations, the personal touches that individual singers add, are in constant flux, creating a living musical tradition that adapts and evolves without anyone consciously directing the process. In your own village, you're part of this tradition whether you think of yourself as musical or not. The songs you sing while working in the fields, the lullabies you might croon to soothe a crying infant, the seasonal chants that mark important moments in the agricultural year. All of these represent your participation in a musical culture that stretches back through countless generations and will continue long after you're gone. But this participation is fundamentally different from what you experienced in the cathedral. Village music is functional, communal, and egalitarian in ways that formal religious music is not. When you sing while working, the goal is not artistic achievement, but practical coordination and mutual encouragement. When the entire community gathers to sing traditional songs during harvest celebrations, the value lies not in the quality of the performance, but in the affirmation of shared identity and common purpose. These different musical worlds, the transcendent complexity of cathedral polyphony and the earthy functionality of village song, coexist in medieval society without ever truly meeting. They serve different purposes, reflect different values, and reinforce different aspects of the social order. The cathedral music emphasizes hierarchy, specialization, and the gap between the divine and the earthly. Village music emphasizes community, participation, and the rhythms of ordinary life. As you walk the long road home from the cathedral town, the memory of that extraordinary music gradually settles into a new understanding of your place in the world. You've experienced something beautiful and transformative, but you've also been reminded of the vast distances that separate different levels of medieval society. The music you heard today exists in a realm that you may occasionally visit, but can never truly inhabit. Yet perhaps this is enough. Perhaps the knowledge that such beauty exists, that human voices can create sounds that seem to touch the divine, that there are realms of experience beyond the daily struggle for survival. Perhaps this knowledge itself is a gift that makes the hardships of ordinary life more bearable. In the silence of your cottage tonight, as you lie on your simple straw mattress and listen to the familiar sounds of your family's breathing, you carry within you the echo of something magnificent. And in the morning, when you wake once again to the profound silence of the medieval world, you'll understand that silence differently than you did before. It's not just the absence of sound, but the space in which rare and precious music becomes possible. It's the quiet foundation that makes every note, every melody, every harmony into something worth treasuring. This is what it meant to hear music for the first time in medieval times. Not just to experience sound, but to discover that the world contained possibilities for beauty and transcendence that you had never imagined. In a life bounded by necessity and hardship, music offered brief glimpses of something beyond the immediate demands of survival. And perhaps, in its very rarity and preciousness, medieval music held a power that our sound-saturated age has forgotten how to feel. As we move from the anonymous voices of medieval congregations to the extraordinary life of a single individual, we encounter a woman whose very existence challenged every assumption about what was possible in the 12th century. While ordinary people experienced music as something that happened to them, a rare gift bestowed by traveling minstrels or cathedral choirs, Hildegard of Bingen claimed that music flowed through her directly from the divine, making her not just a listener, but a conduit for melodies that had never before existed on earth. Born around 1098 in the Rhine Valley, in what is now Germany, Hildegard entered the world during one of the most turbulent periods of medieval history. The First Crusade had recently concluded, leaving Europe buzzing with religious fervor and political upheaval. The Holy Roman Empire was locked in its ongoing struggle with the papacy over who held ultimate authority in Christendom. Into this world of conflict and change came a sickly child who would grow to wield more influence than most kings or emperors of her age. From her earliest years, Hildegard was marked by what she would later describe as visions, experiences so vivid and overwhelming that they left her physically prostrated, unable to speak or move for hours at a time. These episodes began when she was just 3 years old, appearing to her as brilliant lights that would suddenly flood her perception, accompanied by voices that spoke in languages she had never learned but somehow understood perfectly. Her parents, minor nobility with sufficient wealth but no particular influence, found themselves faced with a child they could neither understand nor control. In an age when unusual behavior was often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment, Hildegard's visions could have marked her for persecution or exile. Instead, her family made a decision that would shape not only her life, but the cultural history of medieval Europe. They entrusted her to the care of Jutta of Sponheim, an anchoress who had devoted her life to prayer and contemplation in a small cell attached to the Benedictine monastery of Dissebodenberg. The world Hildegard entered at age 8 was one of almost complete sensory deprivation. Yuda's cell was a simple stone chamber with a single window through which food could be passed, and through which the two inhabitants could observe the altar of the monastery church. The daily routine was structured entirely around the canonical hours, the 8 periods of prayer that divided each day from midnight to midnight. Between these periods of formal worship, the time was filled with reading, copying manuscripts, and meditation. For most children, such an environment would have been crushing in its restrictions and isolation. For Hildegard, it became a sanctuary where her visions could unfold without interruption or judgment. Yuda, herself a woman of unusual learning and spiritual insight, recognized something extraordinary in her young charge and began providing her with an education that far exceeded what most women of any social class could expect to receive. Under Yuda's guidance, Hildegard learned to read and write Latin fluently, mastered the complex rules of medieval music theory, and developed the theological sophistication that would later allow her to correspond as an equal with the most learned men of her age. But perhaps more importantly, she learned to trust her visions, to see them not as symptoms of illness or signs of divine disfavor, but as a special form of revelation that carried with it both tremendous privilege and terrible responsibility. As Hildegard matured from child to young woman, her visions began to take on new characteristics. Where before they had been largely visual experiences, floods of light and color that overwhelmed her ordinary perception, now they increasingly included auditory elements. She began to hear music unlike anything being composed in the monasteries and cathedrals of her time. These melodies were not built on the 8-tone scales that governed conventional medieval music, but seemed to reach beyond the accepted limits of musical expression, incorporating intervals and progressions that musicians of her era considered impossible or inappropriate. The music that came to Hildegard in her visions was characterized by extraordinary melodic leaps that spanned octaves in single phrases, creating effects that were both ethereally beautiful and technically challenging for human voices to perform. Where conventional Gregorian chant moved in careful steps, rarely jumping more than a few notes at a time, Hildegard's compositions soared and plunged with a freedom that seemed to mirror the ecstatic nature of her mystical experiences. When Yuda died in 1136, the small community of women that had gathered around her cell faced a crisis of leadership. By unanimous consent, they chose Hildegard as their new magistra or mother superior, a decision that marked the beginning of her transformation from private mystic to public figure. At 38, she was no longer the sickly child who had been entrusted to Yuda's care, but a mature woman whose learning and spiritual authority were recognized even by the monks of Disibodenberg. But Hildegard's ambitions extended far beyond the management of a small religious community. In 1141, she experienced what she would later describe as the most important vision of her life, a divine command to write down what you see and hear. This mandate launched her on a literary and musical career that would produce some of the most remarkable works of the medieval period, including the Civias, a comprehensive theological treatise that combined mystical revelation with systematic doctrine in ways that had never been attempted before. More relevant to our musical journey, this period also saw the composition of what scholars now recognize as the largest surviving collection of music by any medieval composer. A body of work that includes 77 liturgical songs and the earliest known morality plays set to music. These compositions were unlike anything else being created in 12th century Europe, characterized by the same soaring melodic lines and unconventional intervals that had first appeared in her visions decades earlier. The creation of this music presented Hildegard with a series of practical challenges that illuminate the broader constraints under which medieval women operated. Although she possessed the musical knowledge necessary to compose complex polyphonic works, she lacked the formal training in musical notation that would have allowed her to write down her compositions herself. Instead, she was forced to work with male scribes and musicians who could translate her sung melodies into the written symbols that would preserve them for posterity. This collaborative process was fraught with difficulties that went beyond the merely technical. Medieval musical notation was still in its infancy, lacking many of the precision tools that later composers would take for granted. Rhythm, in particular, was indicated only through context and convention, making it extremely difficult to preserve the subtle timing relationships that gave Hildegard's music its distinctive character. Moreover, the scribes she worked with were trained in the conventional musical styles of their era and often struggled to understand or accurately transcribe the unusual intervals and progressions that characterized her compositions. The result was a body of musical work that pushed against the boundaries of what was considered possible or appropriate in medieval religious music. Hildegard's compositions demanded technical virtuosity from their performers, requiring vocal ranges and control that exceeded what was expected even of trained monastic choirs. Her melodies were not just difficult to sing, they were difficult to remember, lacking the repetitive structures and predictable patterns that made conventional chant accessible to communities with limited musical literacy. Yet despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, Hildegard's music achieved a kind of transcendent beauty that seemed to justify its technical demands. Listeners reported being moved to tears by performances of her compositions, describing emotional responses that went far beyond what they experienced during conventional liturgical music. The soaring melodies seemed to lift both performers and audience into states of consciousness that approached the mystical experiences that had inspired their creation. Word of Hildegard's extraordinary musical compositions began to spread throughout the network of religious houses that connected medieval Europe. Abbots and abbesses from distant monasteries wrote, requesting copies of her work, eager to introduce their own communities to these revolutionary expressions of divine praise. But with fame came scrutiny, and not all of the attention Hildegard received was welcome. The Catholic Church of the 12th century was deeply suspicious of claims to private revelation, particularly when those claims came from women. The institutional hierarchy that governed medieval religious life was built on the assumption that divine truth flowed downward through established channels of male authority, from God to pope to bishop to priest to the faithful. For a woman, even a learned and devout woman like Hildegard, to claim direct access to divine revelation threatened this entire system of religious authority. Hildegard's musical compositions became a particular focus of ecclesiastical concern because they deviated so dramatically from the established traditions of church music. The melodies she claimed to receive in her visions could not be traced to any known sources in the vast library of existing chant. Their unusual characteristics suggested either extraordinary innovation or dangerous departure from orthodox practice, and church authorities struggled to determine which interpretation was correct. The crisis came to a head when Hildegard announced her intention to establish a new religious community independent of the monastery at Dissebodenberg. This decision was motivated partly by practical considerations. The community of women under her leadership had grown too large for their existing quarters, but also by her growing sense that her mission required greater autonomy than was possible under the direct supervision of the male monastic hierarchy. The proposal to establish an independent convent was revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond matters of simple administration. Religious women in the 12th century were expected to remain under the direct authority of male religious superiors, who controlled not only their spiritual development, but also their material resources and external communications. For Hildegard to claim the right to establish and govern her own religious house was to assert a level of independence that challenged fundamental assumptions about women's capabilities and proper role in medieval society. The negotiations that followed were complex and politically charged, involving not only the local monastic authorities, but also the regional bishop and ultimately Pope Eugenius III himself. Hildegard's strategy during these negotiations revealed the sophisticated political skills that would characterize her later career. Rather than presenting her request as a matter of personal preference or administrative convenience, she framed it as obedience to divine command, claiming that her visions had explicitly instructed her to establish a new community at a specific location near the Rhine. This appeal to divine authority placed church officials in an extremely difficult position. To deny Hildegard's request would be to risk opposing God's will if her visions were genuine. but to grant it would set a precedent that could undermine the entire system of religious hierarchy. The solution eventually adopted was a compromise that allowed Hildegard to establish her new convent while maintaining nominal oversight by male religious authorities, an arrangement that satisfied the requirements of canon law while giving her the practical independence she needed to pursue her remarkable career. The new convent of Rupertsberg, established around 1150, became the base of the most productive period of Hildegard's life. Free from the direct supervision that had constrained her earlier work, she embarked on an extraordinary range of activities that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of religious life. She continued composing music, creating some of her most ambitious works, including the musical drama Ordo Virtutum, which told the story of the soul's journey toward salvation through elaborate sung dialogue between personified virtues and vices. But music was only one aspect of Hildegard's multifaceted genius. During the same period, she wrote extensively on medicine and natural philosophy, producing treatises that combined careful observation of the natural world with mystical insight in ways that anticipated later developments in scientific method. Her medical writings, in particular, revealed a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology that was remarkable for any medieval author, let alone a cloistered woman with no formal medical training. Perhaps most remarkably, Hildegard also emerged during this period as one of the most influential political figures of her age. She conducted extensive correspondence with emperors, popes, and kings, offering counsel on matters of both spiritual and temporal governance. Her letters reveal a woman supremely confident in her own authority, willing to criticize even the most powerful figures of her era when she believed they were failing in their duties to God and to their subjects. This political influence was built largely on the reputation for prophetic insight that her visions had established. Medieval rulers, faced with the constant uncertainties of warfare, succession, and divine judgment, were eager to consult anyone who claimed reliable access to divine knowledge. Hildegard's successful predictions of political events and natural disasters enhanced her reputation as a true prophet, making her counsel increasingly sought after by those who wielded earthly power. The height of Hildegard's political influence came during the schism that divided the Catholic Church in the 1160s and 1170s, when competing claimants to the papal throne split European Christianity into opposing camps. Secular rulers found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict that could determine not only their spiritual salvation, but also their political survival. Hildegard's support for the legitimately elected pope carried enormous weight in these deliberations, helping to resolve a crisis that threatened the unity of medieval Christendom. But even at the peak of her influence, Hildegard never forgot that her authority ultimately derived from her role as a conduit for divine revelation. Her music continued to be characterized by the same otherworldly beauty that had first attracted attention to her work, and she continued to insist that her compositions came not from human creativity, but from direct divine inspiration. This claim was not merely a matter of religious humility. It was the foundation of her entire career and the source of whatever power she wielded in medieval society. The theological implications of Hildegard's musical practice were profound and potentially troubling to church authorities. If her compositions truly came from divine inspiration, then they possessed a kind of authority that placed them beyond human criticism or modification. Traditional church music, however beautiful and sacred, was understood to be the product of human craftsmanship working within divinely established guidelines. Hildegard's music claimed a more direct relationship to the divine, suggesting that God continued to reveal new forms of worship and praise through chosen individuals. This claim became the source of ongoing tension between Hildegard and church authorities throughout her career. While her political influence and reputation for prophetic accuracy provided some protection from direct persecution, she was never entirely free from suspicion about the orthodoxy of her teachings and the authenticity of her visions. The very characteristics that made her music so extraordinarily beautiful, its unusual intervals, its demanding vocal requirements, its departure from established traditions, also marked it as potentially dangerous innovation in an institution that valued stability and continuity above all else. The crisis that would define the final phase of Hildegard's career began in the late 1170s, when church authorities imposed an interdict on her convent, a punishment that forbade the celebration of Mass, the singing of liturgical music, and the administration of most sacraments. The specific cause of this conflict was Hildegard's refusal to remove from her convent cemetery the body of a young man who had been buried there after receiving the last rites of the church. Local church officials claimed that the man had died under excommunication and therefore could not legitimately be buried in consecrated ground. Hildegard insisted that he had been reconciled with the church before his death and that removing his body would constitute a grave sin against his soul. When neither side would compromise, the bishop imposed the interdict as a way of forcing Hildegard's submission to ecclesiastical authority. For a community whose entire life was structured around liturgical worship, the interdict was devastating. The daily cycle of sung prayer that had defined their existence for decades was replaced by enforced silence. The music that Hildegard believed to be divinely inspired could no longer be performed in its proper liturgical context. The punishment struck at the very heart of what made their religious life meaningful and transformative. Hildegard's response to this crisis revealed both the depth of her convictions and the sophisticated theological arguments that supported her position. Rather than submitting to authority or seeking compromise, she wrote a lengthy defense of her actions that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying the interdict. She argued that music was not merely a human addition to worship, but an essential component of creation itself, echoing the harmony through which God had brought the universe into being. In her view, to silence divinely inspired music was to participate in the same rebellion against cosmic order that had led to Satan's fall from heaven. The interdict, rather than enforcing divine law, was actually violating it by preventing the proper praise of God from ascending to heaven. This argument transformed what might have been seen as simple disobedience to ecclesiastical authority into a principled defense of divine worship against human corruption. The theological sophistication of Hildegard's defense, combined with the political influence she had accumulated over decades of successful prophecy and counseling, eventually forced church authorities to reconsider their position. After more than a year of negotiations, the interdict was lifted and Hildegard's community was allowed to resume its normal liturgical life. The resolution of this crisis marked a significant victory for the principle that divine inspiration could sometimes take precedence over human authority, even within the hierarchical structure of the medieval church. But the interdict had taken its toll on Hildegard's health and energy. By the time normal worship was restored at Rupertsberg, she was approaching 80 years of age, an extraordinary longevity for any medieval person, but particularly remarkable for someone whose life had been marked by chronic illness and physical frailty. The visions that had defined her career since childhood were becoming less frequent and less intense, and she began to turn her attention to ensuring that her accumulated knowledge and compositions would survive her death. The process of preserving Hildegard's musical legacy for future generations involved challenges that illuminate the broader difficulties of cultural transmission in the medieval period. Unlike modern composers, who can rely on standardized notation systems and mechanical reproduction to preserve their work exactly as intended, Hildegard was dependent on hand-copied manuscripts that were subject to the errors and interpretations of individual scribes. Moreover, the unusual characteristics of her music made accurate copying particularly difficult. Scribes trained in conventional musical notation often struggled to represent the wide melodic leaps and unconventional intervals that characterized her compositions. The result was a manuscript tradition that preserved the basic structure of her music while losing many of the subtle details that gave it its distinctive character. Hildegard was acutely aware of these problems and spent considerable effort during her final years working with scribes and musicians to create authoritative versions of her most important compositions. These collaborative sessions revealed the extent to which her music had pushed beyond the boundaries of what medieval notation could adequately represent. In many cases, the written versions could only approximate the full complexity of the melodies she heard in her visions, requiring oral tradition and personal instruction to preserve essential performance details. The death of Hildegard in 1179 marked the end of one of the most remarkable careers in medieval history. Her funeral drew representatives from religious houses throughout Europe testimony to the extraordinary influence she had wielded during her lifetime. But even as her contemporaries mourned the loss of her prophetic voice and political wisdom, questions remained about the long-term survival of her musical innovations. The compositions that Hildegard claimed to receive through divine revelation were too difficult and unconventional to be easily integrated into the standard repertoire of medieval church music. Their performance required levels of musical skill and training that were available in only a few specialized religious communities. Without the personal authority of their creator to ensure their continued performance, there was a real risk that these extraordinary musical achievements would disappear from active use within a generation or two of her death. And indeed, this is largely what happened. While manuscript copies of Hildegard's music continued to exist in various religious libraries, actual performance of her compositions became increasingly rare. The technical demands of her melodies, combined with their departure from conventional musical structures, made them difficult to maintain in communities where musical literacy was limited and priorities lay with more practical concerns. By the late medieval period, Hildegard's music had become more a historical curiosity than a living tradition. Scholars studying the development of medieval composition might encounter her work in manuscript collections, but few had the opportunity to hear her music performed or to experience the transcendent beauty that had so impressed her contemporaries. Her extraordinary achievement was preserved in written form, but largely lost as a living artistic tradition. The rediscovery of Hildegard's music in the modern era required both scholarly detective work and technological innovation. Musicologists studying medieval manuscripts had to decode notation systems that had fallen out of use, interpret performance instructions that relied on oral tradition, and reconstruct the acoustic environments in which these compositions had originally been performed. The process of bringing her music back to life was as much archaeology as musicology, requiring careful attention to historical context as well as artistic interpretation. When Hildegard's compositions were finally performed again in the 20th century, audiences responded with the same sense of wonder and transcendence that had characterized medieval reactions to her work. The soaring melodies that had challenged 12th century performers continued to push modern singers to the limits of their technical ability, while the unconventional harmonic progressions created effects that seemed to anticipate much later developments in musical composition. The revival of interest in Hildegard's music has coincided with broader changes in how we understand medieval culture and the role of women in historical development. No longer seen as merely a curiosity or an exception to normal patterns of medieval life, Hildegard has come to be recognized as representative of possibilities that existed throughout the medieval period but were often suppressed or ignored by institutions dominated by male authority. Her extraordinary career demonstrates that medieval society, for all its limitations and hierarchical constraints, was capable of recognizing and nurturing exceptional talent regardless of gender. The music she created through her claimed divine visions continues to move listeners nearly a millennium after her death, testament to the enduring power of artistic achievement that pushes beyond conventional boundaries toward new forms of beauty and expression. As we prepare to explore the darker side of medieval music's power in our next segment, Hildegard's story reminds us that music in the medieval world was never merely entertainment or decoration. It was understood to be a force capable of connecting human consciousness with divine reality, of transforming both individuals and communities, and of expressing truths that lay beyond the reach of ordinary language. In her hands, music became a tool for challenging authority, asserting independence, and creating new possibilities for spiritual and artistic expression. The silence that falls over her story with her death in 1179 is not the comfortable quiet of completion, but the more troubling silence of possibilities lost, of a voice so extraordinary that no immediate successor could hope to continue what she had begun. Yet in that silence, we can still hear the echoes of melodies that claim to come from heaven itself, reminding us that even in the most constrained circumstances, human creativity can find ways to soar beyond earthly limitations. From the transcendent heights of Hildegard's divinely inspired compositions, we now descend into one of the most disturbing and inexplicable episodes in the history of music's power over the human mind, where Hildegard's melodies lifted listeners toward heaven, The events that unfolded in Strasbourg during the summer of 1518 demonstrated that music could also drag people into a hell of compulsive movement, exhaustion, and death. The story begins on a hot July morning in 1518, in a narrow street of half-timber houses that leaned precariously over the cobblestones of Strasbourg's old quarter. The city was prosperous, a major trading center where merchants from across Europe gathered to exchange goods and gold. The cathedral's spire dominated the skyline, and the sound of church bells marking the canonical hours provided a reassuring rhythm to daily life. It was, by all appearances, a normal medieval city going about its ordinary business. Then Frau Trophia began to dance. She appeared in the street outside her house sometime after the morning mass, moving to music that no one else could hear. At first, her neighbors assumed she was celebrating some private joy, perhaps good news from a traveling merchant, or relief at recovering from illness. But as the hours passed and her dancing continued, their amusement turned to concern, then to alarm. Frau Trophia was not dancing in the manner of someone enjoying a festival or celebrating a wedding. Her movements were frantic, compulsive, marked by a desperation that was frightening to witness. She spun and leaped and stumbled, her face contorted with exhaustion, but she could not stop. When concerned neighbors tried to restrain her, she fought them off with surprising strength, returning immediately to her wild, rhythmless gyrations. As the sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward evening, Frau Trophia was still dancing. Her clothes were soaked with perspiration, her breathing labored, her feet bleeding from the rough cobblestones. Yet still she moved, as if some invisible force was compelling her body to continue despite the obvious agony the movement was causing. Word of the strange spectacle spread through the city with the speed that news travels in a tightly knit community. By evening, curious crowds had gathered to watch the woman who could not stop dancing. Some laughed, assuming it was an elaborate performance designed to extract coins from gullible observers. Others crossed themselves and muttered prayers, recognizing something supernatural and malevolent in the compulsive nature of her movements. Local physicians were summoned to examine the dancing woman, but their medieval understanding of medicine provided no useful framework for comprehending what they observed. They could find no physical injury that would explain her behavior, no fever or visible symptoms of disease. Her pulse was rapid and irregular, her skin flushed and hot, but these seemed to be effects rather than causes of her condition. As night fell, torches were brought to illuminate the street where Frau Trophia continued her exhausting performance. The flickering light cast her shadow in wild, distorted shapes against the walls of the surrounding buildings, creating an almost demonic atmosphere that reinforced the growing sense that supernatural forces were at work. Still she danced, through the night and into the following dawn, pausing only occasionally to collapse in exhaustion before rising again to resume her compulsive movements. By the second day, something even more disturbing began to happen. Other people in the crowd that had gathered to watch Frau Trophia started to move rhythmically, tentatively at first, then with increasing intensity. A merchant's wife found her feet beginning to tap in time with the dancing woman's movements. A young apprentice began swaying back and forth, his eyes fixed on the relentless figure in the center of the crowd. One by one, as if caught by some invisible contagion, spectators became participants. This was not the joyful, communal dancing that marked religious festivals or seasonal celebrations. The people who joined Frau Trophia moved with the same frantic desperation that characterized her performance, as if they too were being controlled by an external force beyond their conscious will. Their faces showed not joy but terror, not celebration but compulsion. They were not dancing, they were being danced. By the end of the first week, dozens of people had been caught up in the inexplicable epidemic of movement. The city authorities, faced with a crisis unlike anything in their experience, consulted with religious leaders, physicians, and scholars to determine the cause of the outbreak and develop strategies for containing it. The explanations they proposed reflected the medieval worldview's complex mixture of religious belief, medical theory, and folk wisdom. Some religious authorities interpreted the dancing plague as divine punishment for the sins of the community. Strasbourg, like many prosperous trading cities, was home to considerable wealth and luxury that moralists viewed as evidence of spiritual corruption. The compulsive dancing could be God's way of demonstrating the futility of earthly pleasures and the need for repentance and reform. This interpretation suggested that prayer, fasting, and charitable giving might appease divine wrath and end the outbreak. Medical authorities, working within the framework of humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine, proposed that the dancers were suffering from an excess of hot blood that had been inflamed by the unusually warm summer weather. This excess heat was thought to create a state of temporary madness that manifested in uncontrollable movement. The recommended treatment involved bloodletting to reduce the dangerous humoral imbalance, combined with cooling foods and medicines to counteract the excessive heat. But the most influential theory, and the one that would shape the authorities' response to the crisis, was that the victims were suffering from a condition that could only be cured by more dancing. This idea was based on the medieval belief that, like cures like that poison could be driven out by poison, fever reduced by heat, and compulsive movement ended by encouraging even more movement until the malevolent force exhausted itself. Acting on this theory, the city council made a decision that would transform the dancing plague from a local curiosity into a major public health catastrophe. They hired professional musicians to play for the dancers, reasoning that proper musical accompaniment would help the victims dance out whatever force was compelling their movements. Stages were constructed in public squares to provide suitable venues for the therapeutic dancing. Arrangements were made to ensure that the music would continue around the clock until the outbreak ended. The result was exactly the opposite of what the authorities had intended. Rather than providing relief for the existing victims, the constant music seemed to intensify their condition while simultaneously attracting new participants. The number of people caught up in the dancing plague grew from dozens to hundreds as the professional musicians played their encouraging melodies day and night. The music that the hired musicians provided was drawn from the standard repertoire of medieval entertainment: dance tunes, popular songs, and rhythmic pieces designed to accompany normal social dancing. But in the context of the plague, these familiar melodies took on a sinister quality that seemed to amplify rather than alleviate the compulsive behavior they were meant to cure. The steady rhythms that would normally coordinate pleasurable group movement became tools of torture, driving the victims to even greater extremes of exhaustion and desperation. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe scenes that were both tragic and terrifying. Dancers collapsed from exhaustion only to rise again when the music resumed, their bodies moving automatically even when their minds were clearly no longer directing their actions. Some victims danced until their feet bled through their shoes and onto the cobblestones. Others suffered what appeared to be seizures or fits, their movements becoming so violent and uncontrolled that they injured themselves and those around them. The death toll began to mount as the physically weaker victims succumbed to the combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and heart failure that resulted from days of continuous movement. Contemporary records suggest that several dozen people died during the height of the outbreak, though the exact number is difficult to determine because medieval record-keeping was often incomplete and because the symptoms of the dancing plague were easily confused with other medical conditions. As the crisis deepened, alternative theories about its cause began to emerge. Some observers noted that the outbreak had begun during a period of unusual social stress in Strasbourg. The city was experiencing economic difficulties related to failed harvests and disrupted trade routes. Political tensions between different factions within the city government had created an atmosphere of uncertainty and conflict. There were rumors of plague in neighboring regions, adding to the general sense of anxiety and foreboding that characterized life in early 16th century Europe. These social stresses suggested that the dancing plague might be a form of collective psychological breakdown rather than a medical condition with a specific biological cause. The compulsive dancing could be seen as a way for people to express anxieties and fears that had no other acceptable outlet in the rigid social structure of medieval society. The contagious nature of the outbreak supported this interpretation, as psychological conditions often spread through communities much more readily than physical diseases. Other observers focused on the role that religious and cultural beliefs might have played in shaping the outbreak. The medieval period was characterized by a complex relationship between Christian doctrine and older folk traditions that had never been completely suppressed. Many communities maintained beliefs in supernatural forces, demons, spirits, and magical influences that could take control of human behavior under certain circumstances. In particular, there were widespread folk beliefs about the power of music to invoke supernatural forces or to serve as a conduit for demonic influence. Certain melodies were thought to be inherently dangerous, capable of summoning evil spirits or causing madness in those who heard them. Dance, especially the kind of frantic, uncontrolled movement exhibited by the plague victims, was often associated with pagan rituals and devil worship in the medieval Christian imagination. These cultural associations meant that the decision to treat the dancing plague with more music was particularly controversial. While medical authorities argued that therapeutic music could cure the condition, religious conservatives worried that the constant playing of dance tunes was actually feeding the demonic forces that had caused the outbreak in the first place. The longer the crisis continued, the more these concerns began to influence official policy. The turning point came when a group of religious reformers, influenced by the growing Protestant movement that was beginning to challenge Catholic authority throughout Europe, convinced the city council that the dancing plague was indeed a form of demonic possession that required spiritual rather than medical treatment. They argued that the victims needed to be taken away from the music that was sustaining their condition and brought to places where proper Christian worship could drive out the evil influences that had taken control of their bodies. Acting on this advice, the authorities ended the public music performances and began transporting the dancers to nearby shrines and churches known for their healing powers. The most severely affected victims were taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus, an early Christian martyr who was believed to have special power over disorders involving uncontrolled movement. There, in an environment focused on prayer and religious devotion rather than musical performance, the dancing plague finally began to subside. The recovery process was gradual and uneven. Some victims stopped dancing immediately upon entering the sacred spaces, as if the religious atmosphere had broken whatever spell had been controlling their movements. Others continued their compulsive dancing for days or weeks, gradually reducing the intensity and frequency of their movements until they finally achieved complete stillness. A few never fully recovered, remaining subject to periodic episodes of uncontrollable dancing for the rest of their lives. The aftermath of the dancing plague left the community of Strasbourg profoundly shaken and searching for explanations that could prevent similar outbreaks in the future. The failure of medical treatment and the apparent success of religious intervention reinforced the power of supernatural explanations for phenomena that could not be understood within the existing framework of natural philosophy. But it also raised disturbing questions about the relationship between music, consciousness, and social control that would influence European attitudes toward popular entertainment for generations to come. Modern scholars studying the dancing plague of 1518 have proposed a variety of explanations that draw on contemporary understanding of psychology, neurology, and social dynamics. Some researchers have suggested that the outbreak was a form of mass psychogenic illness, a condition in which psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms that spread through a community via social contagion. This explanation accounts for many features of the Strasbourg outbreak, including its rapid spread, its apparent contagiousness, and its eventual resolution when the social conditions that had triggered it were changed. Other scholars have focused on the possibility that ergot poisoning may have played a role in triggering the outbreak. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly during wet growing seasons. When consumed in sufficient quantities, ergot produces symptoms that include hallucinations, convulsions, and involuntary muscle movements that could resemble the compulsive dancing observed in Strasbourg. The summer of 1518 had been unusually wet, creating ideal conditions for ergot growth, and rye bread was a dietary staple for the urban poor who made up many of the plague victims. The ergot hypothesis is particularly intriguing because it provides a biological mechanism that could explain both the initial outbreak and its apparent contagiousness. If contaminated grain was distributed through the city's food supply, it could have affected multiple people simultaneously, creating the impression of a spreading epidemic when the reality was simply that different people were being poisoned at different times as they consumed contaminated bread. However, other aspects of the outbreak are more difficult to explain through ergot poisoning alone. The victim's ability to maintain complex, coordinated movements for days at a time suggests a level of motor control that would be unlikely in people suffering from severe poisoning. Moreover, the social patterns of the outbreak, its tendency to spread through families and social networks rather than randomly throughout the population, are more consistent with psychological contagion than with biological poisoning. Perhaps the most compelling modern interpretation of the dancing plague combines multiple explanatory factors into a complex model that acknowledges the interaction between biological, psychological, and social influences. In this view, the outbreak may have been triggered by a combination of ergot poisoning, social stress, and cultural beliefs about the power of music and dance to invoke supernatural forces. The initial victims, possibly affected by contaminated grain, may have exhibited symptoms that their community interpreted through the lens of existing folk beliefs about demonic possession and musical magic. This interpretation then shaped how other community members responded to the crisis, creating a social environment in which psychological suggestion and collective hysteria could flourish. The decision to treat the condition with music, while well-intentioned, fed into the same cultural frameworks that had made the outbreak possible in the first place. The dancing plague of 1518 was not an isolated incident. Similar outbreaks occurred throughout medieval and early modern Europe, often following patterns remarkably similar to what happened in Strasbourg. These episodes typically began with one or a few individuals exhibiting compulsive dancing behavior, spread rapidly through local communities, and eventually subsided when religious or medical authorities intervened to break the cycle of musical encouragement and social contagion. The recurrence of dancing plagues across different times and places suggests that they reflected something fundamental about the relationship between music, consciousness, and social control in pre-modern European society. Music was understood to possess genuine power, the ability to heal or harm, to invoke divine blessings or demonic curses, to unite communities in celebration or to drive individuals into madness. This power was both celebrated and feared, creating a complex cultural environment in which musical performance was never merely entertainment, but always carried the potential for transformation, both positive and negative. The legacy of the dancing plague of 1518 extended far beyond the immediate community that experienced it. News of the outbreak spread throughout Europe, carried by merchants, travelers, and religious authorities who had witnessed the events firsthand or heard detailed accounts from reliable sources. These reports contributed to a growing body of folklore about the dangerous power of certain types of music and dance, reinforcing cultural anxieties about the relationship between popular entertainment and social order. Religious authorities, in particular, seized upon the dancing plague as evidence of the need for greater control over musical performance and popular culture. The apparent success of religious intervention in ending the outbreak was cited as proof that secular music could indeed serve as a conduit for demonic influence, while sacred music provided protection against such supernatural threats. This interpretation supported efforts to restrict or eliminate forms of musical expression that were seen as potentially dangerous to individual souls or community stability. The impact on musical culture was profound and long-lasting. Communities throughout Europe became more suspicious of musical innovations or performances that departed too dramatically from established traditions. Dance music, in particular, was subjected to increased scrutiny and regulation as authorities sought to prevent the kind of uncontrolled movement that had characterized the Strasbourg outbreak. The spontaneous, ecstatic forms of musical expression that had been common in medieval folk culture gradually gave way to more structured, carefully regulated forms of entertainment that could be more easily monitored and controlled. Yet, even as official culture became more restrictive, the memory of the dancing plague also contributed to a romanticized view of music's power that would influence European artistic development for centuries to come. The idea that music could transcend normal consciousness, that it could transport listeners into altered states of being, became a recurring theme in literature, philosophy, and musical composition. The terrifying compulsion experienced by the plague victims was reimagined as a form of artistic transcendence, a way of accessing truths and experiences that lay beyond the reach of ordinary rational thought. This romanticization of music's transformative power can be seen in the development of opera, where characters regularly sing themselves into states of madness, ecstasy, or death. It appears in the philosophical writings of the Enlightenment, where music is described as the most direct path to emotional and spiritual truth. It continues to influence our contemporary understanding of music's psychological and social effects, shaping research into everything from music therapy to the use of sound in advertising and political propaganda. The dancing plague of 1518 thus serves as a crucial turning point in the European understanding of music's relationship to consciousness and social control. It demonstrated that the same forces that could create transcendent beauty and spiritual elevation could also produce compulsion, madness, and death. This double-edged nature of musical power would become a recurring theme in Western culture, influencing everything from religious policy to artistic theory to scientific research. As we prepare to move from this dark chapter in music's history to the more familiar world of professional court musicians, the memory of Frau Trophia and her fellow victims reminds us that music in the medieval world was never a neutral or purely aesthetic phenomenon. It was understood to be a force capable of reshaping reality itself, of connecting the human world with supernatural realms, of healing or harming depending on how it was used and under what circumstances it was encountered. The silence that finally fell over the streets of Strasbourg in the autumn of 1518 was not the comfortable quiet of a crisis resolved, but the more unsettling silence of a community that had learned to fear the very art form that had previously brought them joy and celebration. In that silence, we can hear the echo of a question that would haunt European culture for centuries to come. If music possesses such extraordinary power over the human mind and body, who should be trusted to control that power? And under what circumstances should it be unleashed? The answer to that question would help shape the development of European musical culture, influencing everything from the structure of court entertainment to the regulation of popular festivals to the emergence of professional musical institutions. The dancing plague of 1518 had demonstrated that music was far too powerful a force to be left entirely to chance or individual choice. From that point forward, musical performance would increasingly be channeled through official institutions that could monitor and control its effects on both performers and audiences. From the terrifying chaos of Strasbourg's dancing plague, we now enter a world where music was carefully controlled, meticulously planned, and performed by professionals who had devoted their entire lives to mastering their craft. The court musician occupied a unique position in medieval society, simultaneously privileged and precarious, valued for possessing one of the most sought-after skills in the medieval world, yet entirely dependent on the whims of noble patrons for survival. Imagine waking before dawn in a small chamber tucked away in the servants' quarters of a great castle. The stone walls around you are thick enough to muffle most sounds from the outside world, but thin enough that you can hear the stirring of other castle inhabitants as the daily routine begins. Your room is spartanly furnished, a narrow bed, a wooden chest for your few personal possessions, and most importantly, a specially constructed rack where your instruments rest like sleeping companions waiting to be awakened. These instruments are your most precious possessions, worth more than everything else you own combined. Your lute, with its delicate wooden body and precisely tuned strings, represents months of a craftsman's labor and cost more than most peasants earn in several years. The small harp that accompanies you on formal occasions require the skills of multiple artisans: a woodworker to shape the frame, a metalworker to forge the tuning pegs, and a specialist in string making to provide the gut strings that produce its sweet, penetrating tone. But beyond their monetary value, these instruments represent your identity, your livelihood, and your only protection against the poverty that threatens anyone in medieval society who cannot perform physical labor. Unlike a blacksmith's hammer or a farmer's plow, your tools require not just skill to use, but years of training to master. They cannot be easily replaced if damaged or stolen, and their proper maintenance demands both technical knowledge and access to specialized materials that are often difficult or expensive to obtain. As you rise from your narrow bed in the pre-dawn darkness, your first concern is not for your own comfort, but for the condition of your instruments. The wooden bodies of stringed instruments are sensitive to changes in temperature and humidity that can cause them to crack, warp, or go out of tune. During winter months, the contrast between the cold stone chambers where you sleep and the great halls where you perform creates constant challenges for maintaining stable tuning. Summer brings different problems. Excessive heat and humidity can cause strings to stretch and wooden joints to loosen. You light a small oil lamp and carefully examine each instrument for signs of damage from the night's temperature changes. The lute strings are checked for proper tension. Too loose, and they will produce a muddy, indistinct tone. Too tight, and they may snap during performance, creating an embarrassing interruption that could cost you your position. The harp receives similar attention. Its numerous strings, each requiring individual adjustment to maintain the precise tuning relationships that make complex musical harmonies possible. This daily ritual of instrument maintenance is more than mere technical necessity. It's a form of meditation that prepares your mind for the challenges ahead. Core performance demands not just musical skill, but psychological preparation for the complex social dynamics that govern life in the noble household. A single wrong note played at the wrong moment could be interpreted as disrespect, incompetence, or even deliberate insult. The difference between a successful performance and a career-ending disaster often depends as much on reading social cues and political undercurrents as on musical technique. The first official duty of your day begins with the castle's morning devotions. As the chapel bell signals the start of lauds, you make your way through the maze of corridors that connect the servants' quarters to the main areas of the castle. The route is familiar, traveled daily for years, but you remain alert to the subtle changes in atmosphere that might signal shifts in the household's political climate. Medieval castles were not just residences, but centers of political and economic power that attracted ambitious individuals seeking advancement, favor, or simply survival. The relationships between different members of the household, from the lord and his immediate family down to the lowest servants, were constantly shifting based on changing alliances, family connections, and the ever-present competition for limited resources and opportunities. As a court musician, you occupied a position that was both elevated and vulnerable, possessing skills that were highly valued, but easily replaced if you fell from favor. Your role in the morning religious service is carefully prescribed by tradition and protocol. You provide musical accompaniment for the household's prayers, but only in ways that are deemed appropriate for your station. The complex polyphonic music that characterizes major religious celebrations is reserved for trained clergy or visiting musicians of higher status. Your contribution is limited to simple instrumental accompaniment for hymns and canticles that the household sings together. Yet even this seemingly straightforward task requires considerable skill and careful attention to social dynamics. The tempo and volume of your playing must be adjusted to match the preferences of whoever is leading the service, often the Lord himself or a senior member of his family. Some patrons prefer a subdued, musical background that supports prayer without drawing attention to itself. Others enjoy more elaborate instrumental embellishments that showcase both their musician's skill and their own sophisticated taste in musical matters. Reading these preferences correctly, often from subtle nonverbal cues, is crucial for maintaining your position within a household. A performance that is too assertive may be seen as an attempt to upstage the religious devotions themselves. Music that is too timid may be interpreted as lack of skill or commitment to the household's prestige. The successful court musician learns to navigate these competing demands with the same precision required for hitting the correct notes and maintaining proper rhythm. After the morning religious observances, you have a brief period to break your fast before the day's more demanding musical duties begin. The meal you share with other household servants provides an opportunity to gather information about the day's planned activities and the current state of relationships within a noble family. Court musicians survive not just on their musical abilities, but on their capacity to understand and anticipate the complex social dynamics that govern their patrons' behavior. Conversations with other servants reveal crucial intelligence about the Lord's mood, visiting dignitaries who may require special entertainment, family tensions that might affect the atmosphere during evening performances, and political developments that could influence the choice of musical repertoire. A song that celebrates military victory might be perfectly appropriate on most occasions, but could cause serious offense if performed when the household is mourning recent battlefield losses or negotiating a delicate peace agreement. This constant need for social and political awareness sets court musicians apart from other skilled craftsmen in medieval society. A stonemason or carpenter can focus primarily on the technical aspects of their work, confident that a well-built wall or properly joined piece of furniture will be appreciated regardless of the political context. Musical performance, by contrast, is always embedded in social relationships and cultural meanings that extend far beyond purely aesthetic considerations. The morning rehearsal period that follows breakfast is perhaps the most technically demanding part of your daily routine. Unlike the relatively simple musical requirements of religious services or background entertainment during meals, evening performances often feature complex compositions that require precise coordination between multiple musicians and careful attention to subtle details of timing, dynamics, and ornamentation. The rehearsal space available to court musicians varies considerably depending on the wealth and musical sophistication of their patrons. In the most prestigious households, there may be a dedicated chamber specifically designed for musical practice, with acoustic properties that enhance the sound of voices and instruments. More commonly, rehearsals take place in whatever space happens to be available. Perhaps a corner of the Great Hall if it's not being used for other purposes, or one of the smaller chambers that serve multiple functions throughout the day. The repertoire you rehearse reflects the complex cultural environment in which court musicians operated. Some pieces are traditional compositions that have been passed down through generations of performers, gradually refined and embellished, but maintaining their essential character over decades or centuries. Others are recent compositions commissioned specifically for your patron or adapted from works created for other noble households. The process of learning and maintaining this repertoire reveals one of the fundamental challenges faced by medieval musicians: the limited and unreliable nature of musical notation. While the most sophisticated courts employed scribes capable of creating detailed written scores, many musical works existed only in oral tradition, passed from teacher to student through demonstration and repetition. Even when written notation was available, it often provided only a basic framework that required considerable interpretation and embellishment by the performers. This reliance on oral tradition and interpretive skill meant that no two performances of the same composition were ever exactly identical. Each rendering reflected the particular abilities and artistic choices of the musicians involved, as well as their understanding of what would be most appropriate for the specific social context of the performance. The successful court musician was not simply someone who could reproduce predetermined musical effects, but an artist capable of adapting and personalizing the repertoire to meet the changing needs and preferences of their patrons. The collaborative nature of musical performance added another layer of complexity to the rehearsal process. Court entertainment often featured multiple musicians playing different instruments or singing different vocal parts, requiring careful coordination and mutual adjustment to achieve the desired artistic effect. Unlike modern orchestras or ensembles that perform under the direction of a conductor, medieval musical groups typically relied on subtle musical and visual cues exchanged between the performers themselves. This collaborative approach to music making created both opportunities and challenges for court musicians. On one hand, it allowed for considerable creative freedom and spontaneous artistic expression within the framework of established compositions. Skilled performers could develop musical partnerships that enabled them to create increasingly sophisticated and emotionally powerful performances through their shared understanding and mutual responsiveness. On the other hand, the collaborative nature of court music also created potential for conflict and competition between musicians competing for their patrons' favor and the limited financial rewards available to court entertainers. A musician whose individual contributions were consistently overshadowed by more skilled or charismatic colleagues might find their position within the household becoming increasingly precarious, regardless of their technical competence or personal loyalty to their patron. As the morning rehearsal period draws to a close, you begin preparing for one of the most challenging aspects of court musical life, providing background entertainment during the midday meal. This may seem like a relatively simple task compared to the elaborate evening performances that showcase your highest artistic achievements, but it actually requires a complex set of skills that go far beyond mere musical technique. The music performed during meals must be carefully calibrated to enhance rather than compete with conversation and social interaction. The volume must be loud enough to create a pleasant acoustic atmosphere, but not so prominent that it interferes with important discussions between the Lord and his guests. The repertoire must be engaging enough to demonstrate your skill and the household's cultural sophistication, but not so complex or emotionally demanding that it distracts attention from the social and political purposes that medieval feasts were designed to serve. Perhaps most challenging of all, mealtime performance requires the ability to read and respond to the constantly shifting social dynamics of the dining hall. The music that accompanies the initial serving of food may need to be quite different from what's appropriate during the main courses, when serious business discussions often take place. The arrival of unexpected guests, changes in the Lord's mood, or developments in ongoing political negotiations may all require immediate adjustments to your musical choices. This adaptive responsiveness represents one of the highest levels of professional skill in medieval musical culture. It requires not only mastery of extensive repertoire that can be drawn upon at a moment's notice, but also the sophisticated social intelligence needed to interpret subtle cues and anticipate the needs of an audience whose attention is primarily focused on matters other than musical performance. The afternoon hours between the midday meal and evening entertainment provide a brief respite from formal performance duties, but they are far from idle time for the dedicated court musician. This period is typically devoted to individual practice, instrument maintenance, and the ongoing process of expanding and refining your musical repertoire. Practice sessions focus on the technical challenges posed by upcoming performances, working through difficult passages until they can be executed with the reliability and polish that court audiences demand. But medieval musical practice involved much more than simple repetition of predetermined musical patterns. The improvisational elements that characterized much court music required constant development of your ability to create spontaneous embellishments, variations, and responses to the musical contributions of other performers. This aspect of musical development reveals another fundamental difference between medieval and modern approaches to musical training. Contemporary musicians typically learn to reproduce existing compositions with as much accuracy as possible, treating departure from the written score as error rather than creativity. Medieval musicians, by contrast, were expected to treat written or traditional musical material as a foundation for personal artistic expression, adding their own ornaments, variations, and interpretive choices to create performances that were simultaneously faithful to established traditions and uniquely their own. The afternoon practice period also provides an opportunity to work on new compositions or arrangements that might enhance your value to your patron or increase your opportunities for advancement within the household hierarchy. Court musicians who could create original works or adapt existing material for specific occasions were particularly valued, as they enabled their patrons to offer entertainment that was both sophisticated and unique. However, the creative work of composition presented its own set of challenges and risks for medieval court musicians. Original compositions had to be carefully crafted to reflect the musical tastes and cultural values of their intended audience, while avoiding any content that might be interpreted as criticism or disrespect. A song that celebrated the wrong military victory, praised a political rival, or inadvertently referenced sensitive family matters could quickly transform a promising musical career into a very short one. As evening approaches and the time for the day's most important musical performances draws near, the atmosphere within the castle begins to shift in ways that you have learned to read and respond to over years of court service. The servants who have been cleaning and preparing the great hall for the evening's entertainment work with increased urgency and attention to detail. Kitchen staff hurry through the corridors, carrying dishes and supplies for the elaborate feast that will accompany the musical program. Guards take their positions at strategic points throughout the castle, their increased vigilance reflecting the importance of the evening's gathering. These preparations remind you that court entertainment serves purposes that extend far beyond simple pleasure or artistic appreciation. Evening musical performances are carefully orchestrated displays of wealth, power, and cultural sophistication designed to reinforce the social hierarchy that sustains the entire feudal system. Your role as a musician makes you a crucial participant in these political theater productions, responsible for creating the acoustic background against which your patron demonstrates their worthiness to hold authority over others. The pressure of this responsibility intensifies as you make your final preparations for the evening's performance. Your clothing must be appropriate to your status as a skilled craftsman worthy of performing before nobility, but not so elaborate as to suggest pretensions above your proper station. Your instruments must be in perfect condition, tuned with precision and polished to reflect the household attention to detail and commitment to excellence in all things. Most importantly, your mental preparation must include a clear understanding of the evening's political and social objectives. Who are the guests that your patron hopes to impress or influence? What messages about power, wealth, and cultural authority need to be conveyed through the choice and presentation of musical entertainment? How can your performance contribute to the success of whatever diplomatic, economic, or social goals your patron hopes to achieve through the evening's festivities? As the great hall fills with guests and the elaborate feast begins, you take your designated position and prepare to begin an evening of performance that will test every aspect of your musical and social skills. The success or failure of the next few hours may determine not only your immediate security within the household, but also your long-term prospects for advancement, financial stability, and artistic fulfillment. The music you perform tonight will be heard by an audience whose attention is divided between multiple competing interests, political negotiations, social networking, business discussions, and simple enjoyment of the food and entertainment. Your challenge is to provide musical accompaniment that enhances all of these activities without overwhelming any of them, creating an acoustic environment that supports the complex social dynamics of medieval court life. As the evening progresses through its carefully choreographed sequence of courses, entertainments, and social interactions, you must remain constantly alert to changing circumstances that may require immediate adjustments to your musical choices. The successful court musician is like a skilled diplomat, reading subtle cues and responding to unspoken needs while maintaining an appearance of effortless competence and appropriate deference to authority. The final test of the evening comes with the conclusion of the formal entertainment, when your patron's satisfaction or dissatisfaction with your performance becomes apparent through their words, actions, or more subtle indications of approval or displeasure. A successful evening enhances your reputation and security within the household. A performance that fails to meet expectations can quickly lead to reduced responsibilities, decreased compensation, or even dismissal from court service entirely. As you carefully pack away your instruments at the end of another day of court musical service, you're acutely aware that tomorrow will bring the same cycle of challenges, opportunities, and risks that have defined your professional life for years. The skills that enable you to survive and occasionally thrive in this demanding environment cannot be learned quickly or easily. They represent the accumulation of countless hours of practice, years of observation and experience, and the gradual development of the complex blend of artistic, social, and political intelligence that successful court musicians must possess. Yet despite the constant pressures and uncertainties that characterize life as a medieval court musician, there are moments, perhaps during a particularly successful performance, when your music helps create an atmosphere of transcendent beauty, or when you see genuine appreciation in the faces of listeners who have been moved by your artistry, when the struggles and sacrifices seem worthwhile. These are the moments that remind you why music has been valued throughout human history as something more than mere entertainment, something capable of touching the deepest aspects of human experience and creating connections that transcend the ordinary boundaries of social class and political difference. The silence that eventually settles over the great hall as the evening's entertainment concludes is not the oppressive quiet of isolation, but but the satisfied silence of a community that is shared in the creation of something beautiful and meaningful. In that silence, you can hear the echo of melodies that will be remembered and discussed long after the immediate occasion has passed, carried forward into the future by the mysterious process through which music becomes part of the collective memory of a culture. This is the paradox of the medieval court musician's existence, simultaneously central and marginal to the society they serve, possessing skills that are both highly valued and easily dismissed, creating art that is both ephemeral and enduring. In a world where survival often depends on the favor of powerful patrons, music provides one of the few paths through which talent and dedication can sometimes transcend the rigid boundaries of birth and social position. As you settle into sleep in your modest chamber, surrounded by the instruments that define your identity and determine your fate, you carry with you the satisfaction of another day successfully navigated in one of the most challenging and rewarding professions available to medieval society. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new risks. But tonight you rest in the knowledge that you have contributed something valuable to the ongoing creation of the cultural heritage that will define your age for generations to come.